Good morning. If there is one thing that has dominated this week's electioneering, it's the battle for the votes of the patriotic working classes. Labour promising fairer Robin Hood taxes and an ethical foreign policy, and the Tories attacking Jeremy Corbyn for being soft on defence while offering those same voters new council houses. Millions of people want answers. Time this morning to probe a little further. And so today, two radically different political personalities go head-to-head. Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who has attacked Theresa May for fawning over Donald Trump, and Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, who has savaged Jeremy Corbyn as feeble and dangerous for Britain. But we're not limiting ourselves this morning to London. Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister and leader of the SNP, is here in the studio talking about why independence, whatever the unionists say, is on the ballot in this election. And our news review this morning features the BBC journalist who has been following Nicola Sturgeon on the campaign trail, our Scotland editor Sarah Smith. The Observer star commentator Andrew Rawnsley, and from The Sun, pulling no punches, Jane Moore. But first, the news with Sian Lloyd.
Good morning. An international effort is underway to track down the criminals behind the global cyber attack that wreaked havoc across the NHS on Friday. Hospitals, GP surgeries and ambulance services across England and Scotland were disrupted when their IT systems were infected by malicious software. Most services are back to normal, but experts fear that hackers may seek to exploit the chaos. The Conservatives say they'll join forces with councils and housing associations to build thousands of new homes for rent if they win the general election. However, it's not clear how much money the Tories would invest, and Labour have dismissed the announcement as spin. Labour says that if it wins the general election, it will impose a so-called Robin Hood tax on financial transactions in the City of London. They say the levy would raise £26 billion over the next Parliament for public services. The Conservatives said it was madness to target the financial sector. Portugal has won the Eurovision Song Contest for the first time in the competition's history. The United Kingdom, represented by the former X Factor contestant Lucy Jones, got its best result in 6 years after coming 15th. Well, that's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks for that. And so, as usual, to the papers, and I'm starting with that NHS story. It's all over many of the papers. The Mail on Sunday said there were 66 alerts to the NHS, but nothing was done before the cyber attacks. The Sunday Telegraph has the same story there. NHS cyber chaos hits thousands of patients, and lots of political stories as well, as you'd expect. The Sunday Times, Harry Styles is apparently against Brexit. Why we need to know this, I don't know, but the Sunday Times feels we do. And they've splashed on Theresa May's pledge on a council house revolution, they say. So that'll be interesting to talk about. Now, lots of Remainers are targeting pro-Brexit MPs, we're told, in this election, trying to knock them out. Here's the opposite happening, according to The Observer. A millionaire Brexit donor is targeting 140 pro-Remain MPs. We get a very pro-Brexit Parliament. So lots of local stories there to follow up. And Sun Express, therefore, May to smash Maggie record, it says. Perhaps optimistically, we will see. Now, we're going to start, I think, with the big cyber story, which is really the story of the week.
Yes, The Observer, yes, unless you've been locked in a cupboard, you will, over the last 24 hours, you'll know that the NHS has been the victim of a cyber attack, as have other organisations worldwide. It's called Eternal Blue. Sounds like a paint colour.
Oh, maybe it sounds like Mrs. May.
Yes, it's some malware software. Anyway.
And it was originally designed by the NSA in the States,
yes,
and possibly by our own spooks as well, working with them. So it's a piece of, as it were, government's own software, which has been nabbed and then turned against
Which, of course,
everybody.
Microsoft had said, issued a warning about in March and had put out there ways to thwart it, but the NHS didn't do it, or a lot of them didn't do it. And it's like all of us, you know, you don't get your house secured, you don't want to spend the money until you get burgled, yes, and then you do it. Yeah. But there's a really good piece here, Charles Arthur, technology writer. And he's sort of taking a little bit of the mickey out of Amber Rudd, I have to say. But he said she was on the radio yesterday. Patients have been inconvenienced, but no patient data has been accessed. And the NHS is brilliantly managing through this. But he says, unfortunately, also, the NHS staff can't access the data. But he says Rudd can burble on as much as she wants, but the £1 billion put in is a fraction of the amount needed to upgrade
Well, that's the real
NHS
question.
system.
Shouldn't we be spending a lot more money protecting not just the NHS, but all sorts of institutions against these attacks?
And it's not just, I mean, in this case, it's a big and much loved on the whole public institution, the NHS, but we've seen previous cyber attacks. Private companies have been just as vulnerable and their customers have had just as many problems. And a difficulty for all big organisations is cybercrime by its nature is quite nimble. And so, yeah, money may be part of it, but a lot of it may be just keeping ahead of the cyber criminals.
What's interesting about the fact that this has made such headlines is this has been happening to private companies and to large charities as well for years and years, but they haven't liked to admit it because it makes them look vulnerable.
And undermines public confidence.
Exactly. Now we all know that this has happened to the NHS. It's opening a can of worms as to what's happening.
And also, in fairness
sorry.
to the trusts, you know, the minute they say, if they said 6 months ago we're going to spend £5 billion on a computer, everyone's going to go, the NHS cut, you know,
what about my operation? Yes.
So,
well, it might not take £5 billion because there's a great
There is a hero here in this
There is
story.
a hero, the 22-year-old surf dude. Nobody actually knows his name. His online handle is malware tech, but within a few hours, he says, he was able to find a way to save the NHS computers and to disable the malware, which is fascinating. They know he lives in the southwest of England and that he's a keen surfer, and he says it only took him a couple of hours, so maybe it won't take £5 billion to upgrade the
Maybe we
entire
just
system.
need a few more like that, guys,
exactly.
on the payroll.
a few teenagers.
Now, there's a ripple of expectation running through the country because we're going to turn to the general election coverage. Jane, you've got Sir Craig Oliver,
Yes,
former David Cameron man.
interestingly, his byline is just simple Craig Oliver, not
Was
Sir
he ashamed
Craig.
of the
Who knows?
knighthood he got from his mate David Cameron?
He's done a piece saying that, you know, it's all very well for everyone to say it's a shoe-in for Theresa May, but actually, if you don't think the manifesto matters, you couldn't be more wrong. And he says that this week she's going to have to prove that she is on the side of the people and that what she said isn't just windy rhetoric. He says, of those in the picture, Theresa May is the last one truly standing, will be master of all she surveys on June the 9th. But her manifesto could be the route map between being seen as a great Prime Minister or it could just be a bland document that puts safety first. So time will tell.
Interesting. Andrew, there are two different stories happening at the same time in terms of what's really going on in this election campaign. And the Mail on Sunday has a big poll by Michael Ashcroft, which suggests a vast Tory landslide.
Yes, we should say former Tory Treasury, but he had, as usual, the papers poll fairly intensively when you've got a campaign on. And indeed, yes, here we have the Mail on Sunday, which says it's a shock. Mega poll reveals true scale of Labour collapse in North, putting PM on track for 172-seat landslide. Now, funnily enough, if you talk to Conservative campaigners, they would regard this story, I suspect, as deeply unhelpful, because one of the worries within Conservative high command is gives the impression it's all over. Theresa May's just steamrolling away to a massive majority, and then they worry, will Conservative voters turn out? And maybe it'll make Labour supporters cross enough, whatever they might think of Jeremy Corbyn, maybe, to turn up.
Because the other side of this story is, if you look at most of the polling today, Labour is up above 30%, better than sometimes that Ed Miliband was doing, despite all the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn. It's not clear that Jeremy Corbyn being out on the campaign trail, being seen more on television, is doing Labour any harm at all. Well,
the Sunday Mirror, as you say, Corbyn is closing gap, according to them, though they do add Tories still on top.
Here we are getting
and according to them,
about...
by 18-point lead. I mean, part of the problem is, and even the honest pollsters would probably say this candidly, we know they overestimated the Labour vote at the last general election.
Well, that's what I'm going to say.
Now, they've tried
to
correct.
excited about the polls because they're not very correct most of the time.
They've tried to correct. Now, have they overcorrected? And now are they underestimating the Labour vote? Or have they not corrected enough, which would be really alarming for Labour, because it would mean they're doing even worse than the polls.
And everybody is really careful about polls now, but we're not exactly talking about somewhere where we're in the margin of error here when you're talking about Labour having closed the lead to 18%.
No, I mean, they could be half wrong and Mrs May would still be back in Downing Street.
Indeed. Now, Sarah, you've got a story on the tablet there, because, of course, there are the Scottish The Scottish election is going on as well, and different manifestos in Scotland. And possibly one of the really big stars of the campaign so far has been Ruth Davidson.
Absolutely. Ruth Davidson is hoping to lead a Tory revival into Westminster. They've only got one seat in Westminster at the moment. They've got a private target of reaching 10 or 12 seats in Scotland, which would be remarkable. And the story in Scotland on Sunday today is that Ruth Davidson will announce a U-turn on prescription charges when they launch their Scottish manifesto. And this will be fascinating because the UK Tory policy is still to charge for prescriptions. But in Scotland, they've been free. It was an SNP policy that the Labour Party voted for as well. Now the Conservatives are getting behind the idea, apparently, of free prescriptions, probably because they're trying to eat into the Labour vote. I mean, the election in Scotland is split very much between nationalists who support independence and will probably vote SNP, and then unionists on the other side. The Tories are very much hoping to say, we're the party of the union. If you don't want a referendum, vote for us. So they have to try and bring Labour and Liberal Democrat voters with them, with policies like this on free prescription charges that might attract them.
Very interesting. Let's move away from the election now, Jane, to the Rachel Nicholl murder. Was one of those sort of terrible, terrible moments that many of us remember from the time.
I remember this as if it was yesterday, and it was 25 years ago, astonishingly.
Richmond Park.
Yeah, and no, Wimbledon Common.
Wimbledon Common.
Wimbledon Common. Her son, who was there at the time, and it's very interesting, I think, also about trauma and toddlers, because he wasn't quite 3. You wondered how much of it he would have remembered, because he was there, obviously, when his mother was stabbed to death. And he says, the moment I watched my mother's soul leave her body is one I will never forget. He's written a book called Letting Go, a true story. And his father, if you remember, Andre, took him off to France, so he didn't become this sort of media sensation, which I think was probably a very good move. And what I find most fascinating about this is that a guy called Robert Napper went to prison for this murder. And he says, I forgive him. I forgive my mother's killer. He had a rough upbringing and childhood. He was a schizophrenic. He's tried to commit suicide. He said, I don't feel resentment.
That is remarkable,
I think that is remarkable. Yeah, it's fascinating read.
Yeah. Very, very interesting indeed. Now, a bit of foreign politics, of course, because the other extraordinary story of the week was Trump sacking his FBI boss. And that extraordinary language he used, "You are hereby terminated," he said.
Yes.
Absolutely amazing. And this is being compared to Watergate as one of the great Washington scandal moments unfolding.
It's an absolutely astonishing story that talks about, obviously, how Donald Trump sees the way he can use his presidency, what's happening with the FBI, the investigation into Russian hacking of the election. And the story that the Sunday Times have today is interesting. They said that the FBI chief, James Comey, who was sacked, is planning to strike back at Trump, giving interviews and possibly congressional testimony about why he was sacked. Now, what's fascinating, of course, is it was probably because of congressional testimony he gave in the first place that Trump sacked him when he called him a showboat and a grandstand.
And in the United States, especially when Congress gets interested in doing investigations, and Democrats particularly, but also some Republicans have an interest in pursuing this, the process just takes over and you get endless investigations, inquiries, and people keep pulling at the threads until things unravel. I mean, that's a large part of the story of Watergate.
It takes a while. I mean, you mentioned Watergate. It was a year between the president sacking the special prosecutor and finally having to resign. This could play out over quite a long time.
And meanwhile, Trump has issued this extraordinary, menacing warning that Coney had better hope that there aren't tapes of their conversations, as if he has been taping what's going on in the White House so that he can use it against his enemies.
That does, of course, reek of Richard
Yes.
Nixon. We're not saying Donald Trump's Richard Nixon at the moment, but it does reek of that era, doesn't it?
Absolutely
Tapes of phone
What's
calls.
really interesting as well about it, I think, is it shows you, as you see Trump just doing what he wants, sacking the FBI director when he feels like it, the American Constitution that we thought could constrain the powers of a president like this, it can't. It's just the norms of politics
Nothing
that do that.
constrain Donald.
Back to earth with a bump and supermarket prices, a story in the Sun now.
Yes, I mean, in this election campaign, we're going to have lots of figures which may or may not be very dodgy from politicians, and forecasts that prove to be completely untrue. For a lot of people, they feel the economy in their weekly shopping basket. I hear the Sun on Sunday headlines this quite wittily, I think, warning unexpected price hike in the bagging area. And it reports that supermarkets have raised prices of their own brand products by up to 160% in the last year. Now, what the Sun doesn't mention, because it was pro-Brexit, of course, that this might have something to do with the slide in the value of sterling since Britain voted to leave the
Or
European
it could
Union.
just be supermarkets being generally naughty.
It could be that. But anyway, warning, the price of your foodstuffs in the shops is going up by quite a lot.
Finishing off with the voice of the sun, fizzy water.
Yes,
Jane.
well,
A very worrying
as a
story for us all.
self-confessed enophile, which
What's
I
an
discovered this
enophile?
means a lover of wine, on the very few occasions that I do drink something non-alcoholic, I go for fizzy water because I think, oh, how virtuous am I? No calories, blah. No, fizzy water apparently makes you fat. Now,
I can't understand how that could be.
It's a weird thing, but it's because the carbonation
You're full of
makes you
bubbles.
want to eat more. It stimulates your appetite. So it's not the actual product, but it makes you want to eat more.
Stick to the wine in future.
Yes.
Stick to the wine.
Some people are still enjoying breakfast, so we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Labour Party in this, and we're joined now by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry.
Morning.
Good morning, Emily Thornberry. In a few weeks' time, you could be Foreign Secretary. Will you, at that point, tell Donald Trump he is not welcome here for a state visit?
No, because he's been invited, and I don't think it's right for us to disinvite him. I think it was a mistake to invite him quite as quickly as he was invited. Frankly, Obama had to wait for years. I think it would have been better to see him settle down.
Some people will say so much for your radical change in the ethical foreign policy. Jeremy Corbyn himself said he was not welcome in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, it takes these things in stages. I think we have to welcome the American president to Britain. We have to work with him. The difference that I have is I would be prepared to stand up to him. I would be prepared to say, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but you're wrong about that. We are supposed to be good friends, and these values are not our values. You're doing the wrong thing.
So you have him over here and then you give him a scolding. You know what he's like. He may well not want to come under those circumstances.
Well, there we are. I mean, I also hear that he doesn't want to share a carriage with Prince Charles because he doesn't agree with Prince Charles on climate change. I mean, it will be a bumpy ride if President Trump
under
comes
Labour,
to Britain.
anyway, he still comes here this summer if you're Foreign Secretary.
We can't disinvite him once he's invited. I think that would be a great mistake.
Why not?
Because I think that it would be to the detriment of our country.
Right. Let's move on to the ethical foreign policy directly. You've said that Labour, unlike the Conservatives, would not turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in, for instance, China. What does that actually mean?
I think that we should not be afraid to raise these issues, and we should not be afraid to raise these issues despite the fact that we may be going for a trade deal with a particular country, but we do have to be clear about the things that we disagree with the country with. And I am very worried that when I see Theresa May going to, the Gulf states, for example, and desperately after trade deals and so on, she doesn't raise the issue of Yemen. She doesn't raise the fact that Saudi Arabia has been bombing weddings and funerals and civilian targets and so on.
Is your ethical foreign policy sufficiently ethical that if you raise these issues and you get given a very dusty response or a hostile response, the Chinese hate this kind of thing being raised, and you actually stop trade deals happening, you'd go as far as to endanger trade deals, endanger the involvement of the Chinese, for instance, in our nuclear industry?
Don't take these too far. I'm not saying that we're going to boycott China, for heaven's sake, but there is a middle way through the sort of fawning, frankly, which I think that we have seen Theresa May indulging in relation to Donald Trump, and the way in which we would approach things.
Let me turn, if I might, to Trident, because this is another issue. You don't like the Trump administration, and yet we rely on that administration for very close cooperation to make our Trident submarines work in terms of targeting and so forth. Do you withdraw that cooperation? Will our nuclear deterrence still depend upon the Americans under Labour?
The most important part of our defence is NATO. And that is a partnership that we have with America and the rest of our NATO allies. And we are committed to that, and we should be. And we have been committed to NATO for a number of years, and that continues. And so we need to work collectively with NATO.
So from your point of view, NATO is very, very important and a crucial part of our international obligations.
Yes.
I ask you that because Jeremy Corbyn clearly disagrees with that. I'm going to ask you to look at something he said very recently. Here's Jeremy Corbyn talking directly about NATO, and the words are very important.
We, in the radical end, the left of the unions and the Labour Party, have got to be realistic that NATO is a major problem and a major difficulty, and we have to campaign against NATO's power, its influence and its global reach, because it is a danger to world peace and a danger to world security.
So there it is. Are you going to campaign against NATO's world power or not?
I think that's a quote from 6 years ago, and Jeremy
Well,
has
Jeremy
Jeremy has been on a journey, to coin a phrase, and there have been a number of discussions, and it has been made, you know, it is quite clear that the predominance of opinion, and within the Labour Party, is that we are committed to NATO. And the reality, the reality is that we have been relying on our partnership in NATO and the way that we have been buying things, the way in which we have been committing things. If we were to pull out of NATO, our forces would be, for example, how would we get our forces? No, hang on. How would we get our forces off Salisbury Plain at the moment without the assistance of NATO? We don't have enough frigates to be able to move them onto the continent of Europe, if necessary, if the Russians were to come rolling over the hill.
Have you made these points to Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes, I have.
And so you've put him back in his box compared to what he was saying, because he repeated those kind of sentiments during his first leadership campaign.
You will see from the manifesto that our commitment to NATO is a clear one.
And you repudiate what Jeremy Corbyn was saying there in 2011?
I'm not fighting with anybody. I am telling you that the Labour Party's position is a clear one. And I am Shadow Foreign Secretary.
This is somebody who's going to be Prime Minister if you win the election, and he is saying that NATO is a major international problem and that the Labour Party should campaign against it.
It's not fair. If you heard what he said at Chatham House, he did not say this. He did not say this. You know, he is clear that we have a commitment to NATO, and that is that.
So you can unsay these kind of things? I mean,
you can change your mind.
Very clear...
You can change your mind. You'll find that lots of politicians change their minds.
Let's move on to the United Nations, generally speaking.
Yes.
Will a Labour government, Britain, engage in military operations without the support of the UN, ever?
We don't think that it is right for there to be interventions in other countries without it being done on a multilateral basis. We do not think that it was right for Theresa May to give unconditional support to Donald Trump in bombing Syria. We don't think that was right. We don't think he should be encouraged to think that it's right for him to behave unilaterally. We think that that undermines the security of the world. And the best way for the international community to proceed is by way of agreement. And it makes it difficult.
Which means the UN Security Council.
It means the UN Security Council.
Because my question, therefore, is it right to give countries like China, whose human rights record you've attacked, and Russia a veto over any possibility of us using military action ever, which is really what you're saying?
I think it is very difficult. I mean, I think, for example, in Kosovo, for example, which is a historic example, the Russians were vetoing the use of military force in relation to Kosovo, but there was international agreement that there should be some action in Kosovo, with the exception of the Russians. And there was the development of the doctrine of responsibility to protect, and so under that doctrine, it was legal at that point for there to be an involvement in Kosovo. Robin
Cook led the charge on that. You've cited him a lot.
Yeah,
he led the charge on that, and he voted for that.
And he was responsible.
And
he was developing the responsibility to protect doctrine.
And Jeremy Corbyn voted and spoke against that involvement. Who was right, do you think, Robin Cook or Jeremy Corbyn?
I think that Robin was right.
Robin was right, and Jeremy Corbyn was wrong about that. And looking ahead to other possible areas of tension, do you think a future Labour government would send a task force again to the Falklands if there was a crisis there?
Yes.
They would. So under those circumstances, because again Jeremy Corbyn has said he wants to settle down and negotiate with the Argentine government about the future of the Falklands, and I wonder if you would be part of that negotiation.
I think that as a matter of last resort, if British citizens are being attacked, we defend them. But we don't want to get into a position whereby, unlike the Conservatives, who seem to be so gung-ho, who seem to be so kind of, we'll send in a task force, we'll bomb this, we'll do that. No, that you have to look at the alternatives first. You have to try, I mean, in the end, there is no settlement to international disputes without there being international agreement. And it's a question of how do you get there fastest. But if we're under attack, we defend ourselves.
Do you think there is an available compromise over the Falklands to be done?
Well, I think that so long as the people of the Falklands wish to remain British, they remain British, so that's not going to be compromised. I think that there needs to be a future in terms of talking to neighbours of the Falklands, and I think that it is to the economic advantage of both that they're able to work more closely than they are at the moment, but certainly not undermining the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands.
Because again, you see, this doesn't seem to be what Jeremy Corbyn thinks. It seems to me ridiculous that in the 21st century we'd be getting into some enormous conflict with Argentina about the islands just off it. Yes, of course, the islanders have an enormous say, but let's bring about some sensible dialogue, he says. So in a sense, he is saying, let's talk about the future of the islands.
Well, I don't disagree with
what... I'm being very unfair to you,
You're being extremely unfair.
I'm quoting Jeremy Corbyn
No, you're not. No, it's fine. what Jeremy just said, why do I disagree with that? I don't see why I should disagree with that. I mean, you say, this is what he says, and in effect, therefore, he's saying something. I don't agree with you. I think what I've said is entirely in line with what Jeremy's just said.
Let's ask you about the big policy announcement of the last couple of days from the Labour Party, the Robin Hood tax.
Yeah.
Now, Sadiq Khan, who's in charge of London, has called this madness and says if you proceed without international agreement on a tax like this, companies just leave the UK at a time when we're leaving the EU already, and it's a really, really dangerous policy.
Well, I don't think that's an exact quote from Sadiq.
Madness is exact.
But the truth is that at the moment we have a tax which applies when you buy stocks and shares, and at the moment some people who are called market makers, who are hedge funds and so on, if they buy these shares, they don't pay the tax. Don't really understand why that is. That seems to be a development. And then the other thing is that we also think that we should extend a tax to different types of financial instruments such as derivatives, because actually that's a betting on the stock market, and it will help to stabilise the stock market. Many other countries do it. Hillary Clinton wanted to do it if she was elected as president. No one's saying that she's trying to undermine Wall Street. The European Union are looking into developing a policy in relation to it.
But you'd agree it should be done in coordination with other countries to avoid hedge fund managers simply moving to Paris or moving to Dublin or wherever they want to move to? I mean, you want to keep the businesses in
Well,
Britain.
I think that actually the House of Lords committee on this was very interesting, and they looked at any changes of behaviour, and they said that they didn't think that it would be as drastic as some of the doomsayers say that it will. Right. And it's, in the end, it is a question of just, I think, of just tidying this tax up. It doesn't seem to me to be right that you can bet on the stock market or bet on a company's debts and not have to pay tax, whereas if you want to invest in the company, you have to pay tax.
OK, one final question. What do you say to your colleagues like Ben Bradshaw, who are going around telling voters in their local constituencies, vote for me, that doesn't mean a Labour government?
I think that everyone wishes to have, there is a choice. We will either get a Conservative government or a Labour government. And that is the choice that the people have coming up in front of them. And there is an entirely different vision. Our vision for Britain is an entirely different one to the Tories one. And people, and people need to accept that.
So those Labour candidates who say, vote for me, that does not affect the future of the government, are being defeatist?
Well, I mean, I think that we have another 3 weeks to go. I think that everything is to play for, and I think that we have, you can see the way in which we on a day-to-day basis are attracting more support. I think that the things that we came out with in the manifesto are enormously popular. Actually, we're talking to the public. We're giving them answers to their day-to-day problems. And people need to look at what choice they have. Not Theresa May's hair, not whether or not Jeremy Corbyn should shave or anything like that. Is about which politicians can offer you what. What is the two different futures that Britain has? And the Labour one is a much more positive one and is much more in line with what people want. There is all to play for, and I don't want them to be, to be quite as defeatist as he is.
As to whether Jeremy Corbyn should shave, we can discuss that later on because you're going to come and join us again. But for now, Emily Thornberry, thank you very much indeed. And so to the weather, a massive leak. A huge amount of wind, chaos and bluster all over the place. But enough of that, it's time to go to the weather studio and Helen Willits.
Andrew, the skyline behind me at Roy Bridge in Highland does look a little chaotic, doesn't it? And we will see some turbulent skies today with the showers, which are already turning a little thundery out west. But this is the rain that many in the east awoke to, giving some much needed rain for the gardens. It's clearing out the way now, and it's a lovely start to the day for many parts of the country. Much brighter skies to come across the east of Scotland once that rain clears. It will linger for northern Scotland, but there'll be a good handful of heavy showers across Highland and Grampian region with hail and thunder in there. Similarly so across Northern Ireland, but equally some lengthy spells of dry weather with strong sunshine in between. There'll be also a scattering of showers across England and Wales. Some areas might see one or two more showers than others, and the coast looks set to get the best of the sunshine. It'll feel warm, of course, away from the showers, which will be quite blustery at times. They ease overnight, so it'll be quite chilly initially in eastern areas, but here comes more chaos as we head towards Monday morning. Wind and rain to boot, and it's May. It does look rather inclement tomorrow, unfortunately. Some quite heavy rain across the southwest Scotland, northwest England and North Wales. Even some rain further south and east. I suppose the consolation prize is that it's mild, so it's warm rain, but the unsettled weather is set to continue through Tuesday and midweek. In fact, by then it looks very wet in southern and eastern areas. Andrew.
Lots more leaks to come. Now, Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, has been used by the Prime Minister as her faithful attack dog so far in the election campaign. He is not, I think it's fair to say, a massive fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but of course he has lots of questions to answer about the state of Britain's armed forces under the Conservatives. Welcome, Mr Fallon. In 2015, the Conservatives made a solemn promise to the electorate about the size of the armed forces. Can you remind people what that promise was?
Yes, we said we would build the army up to 82,000 by the year 2020.
And what is the size of the armed forces now?
It's coming up. It's just over 79,000.
So you have not kept that promise?
We haven't got there yet. It's not 2020 yet. We said for the 5 years of the Parliament, we would build up the armed forces, including reserves. We would get reserves up to just over 30,000.
You said, well, the quote was that we were going to maintain the size of the regular armed services and not reduce the army to below 82,000. The current figure is 79,000 of regular army. So you have broken that promise.
Well, we said we'd do this over the Parliament, and we're spending a lot of money on
But
recruiting.
you have reduced the army. Well, you said you wouldn't, and you have.
Well, we're increasing the size of the army up to 2020. There are 3 more years to go until 2020. We have recruitment campaigns going on. We're increasing the size of the Royal Navy. We're increasing the size of the Royal Air Force. And we're determined, of course, to improve the offer we make to our servicemen and women to attract the best of each generation to join.
Because at the moment your recruitment is going badly, you're not getting enough people into the army. You were meant to get 9,500 in this year, it's 6,000, and you're going backwards, not forwards.
No, I don't accept that. We are getting more people to join up, both regulars and reservists.
You say you don't
and
accept that.
We have several years to go before we reach our target, but we are spending more on the armed forces. The defence budget goes up every year, and we're giving them the new equipment that they need.
Well, you said, I don't accept that. I don't accept those figures. Let me give you them again. The target was 9,580 people to join the army last year, and the figure you achieved was 6,900. And that is why the top brass are so worried about you and worried about the army under you.
First of all, we can't force people to join the army. We don't have conscription in this country. The army has to compete with other sectors of the economy.
So that was a silly promise, perhaps, in the first place?
No, it was a promise over the Parliament, over the 5 years. We're only 2 years into the old Parliament, and I can assure you we are spending a lot of money on recruiting, but also on giving the armed forces the equipment they need. You've seen our aircraft carriers being built up at Rosyth. There are new frigates on the way to cut steel on in July. We're buying new aircraft, and we're investing in the equipment they need.
Now, you've said that you're going to increase defence spending by 0.5% above inflation. Yes. How much does that cost?
That costs roughly over the 5 years of the new Parliament, added to the 2 years of the last Parliament. That gives the armed forces roughly £1 billion more than they would have had if we'd simply met the 2% target.
So where does the money come from?
The money comes from a growing economy. It's a commitment we made. It's a choice to spend more on the health service, to spend more on defence, and we've reduced spending, as you know, in other areas.
So this is an unfunded commitment?
No, it's
going a bit Diane Abbott.
No, it's absolutely funded. It's not a wild commitment. It's properly financed, and we can afford to do that.
From where? Because the money has to come from somewhere.
It comes,
is it more borrowing, or is it more taxes, or what?
Well, borrowing is slowly going to be reduced, but it comes from a growing economy, is the real answer to your question. Because we're running the economy efficiently, because the economy is growing each year, more people in work, we have more revenue coming in, and we're able to make choices, not wild spending or borrowing promises like Labour, but to spend more on the NHS, to spend more on defence, the things that people really care about.
That's the extra billion. Now, according to the Defence Select Committee and the Times newspaper, there's a black hole in your equipment budget of between £7.5 and £10 billion. How are you going to fill that?
Look, we're planning the biggest equipment programme in generations. As I said, new aircraft carriers, new frigates, new maritime patrol aircraft, new planes to go on the frigates, new armoured vehicles.
Okay, but it's the National Audit Office, actually.
Let me answer it. You asked it, let me answer it. That is a 10-year programme, and part of the cost of that programme has to come from efficiency savings, getting rid, for example, of land and barracks and buildings that we don't need, being more efficient in the way that we work.
Now, we have to deliver £7.3 billion of getting rid of fields.
7.3 billion over the 10-year period, over the 5-year period, of efficiency savings on top of the efficiency savings we've already made. Now, that means if you've got airfields you don't need, you shut them down and you release them for housing.
Mr. Fallon?
Well, we have 60 airfields. We don't need 60 airfields. You have to look at what you don't need. You have to be more efficient as a large organisation and look at ways of working. And it's absolutely right that to invest in that programme, we have to reinvest the efficiency savings that we make. And the big change in the last few years, by the way, is that we keep all of those efficiency savings. The Treasury doesn't come and nab them back.
All right, well, you haven't persuaded your top brass, you haven't persuaded senior military people who wrote a letter to the Prime Minister recently. Let me read you a little bit of it.
Sure.
It says that your statements about the defence budget have been disingenuous, quoting irrelevant financial statistics, and they go on to say the government boasts of spending 2% of GDP on defence. That's widely criticised as an accounting deception. The armed forces are having to seek further, very damaging savings in manpower, support and training at a time when the likelihood of combat operations is increasing.
The 2% figure is not our figure, it's the NATO figure. It was
no, but
confirmed...
it's the way you've met it that they're criticising.
No, on the contrary, it is the NATO figure. The Secretary-General of NATO, Stoltenberg, was in London this week seeing myself and the Prime Minister, and he confirmed publicly that according to the NATO definitions, we are meeting the 2%. In fact, we're meeting nearly 2.2%. It is other countries that are not spending up to the 2%. He has confirmed that our spending is defined according to the NATO guidelines.
But these are former chiefs of the defence staff.
These
are guys covered in brass.
Have you ever met somebody covered in brass, a former defence chief, who doesn't want more spent on defence?
So they're just rattling the tap.
They are passionate about defence, and so am I. I'm proud that the defence budget is increasing this year. It was 35 billion last year. It's 36 billion this financial year. It'll go up to 40 billion over the next few years, and we will be investing in the biggest equipment programme the armed forces have seen in generations. Now, to do that, we also have to be more efficient about the way we work.
What patently this government has not properly invested in is defences against cyber attack. You did not give the NHS the proper support and the proper money to stop this cyber attack, with terrible results for patients up and down the country.
In our security review, just over a year and a few months ago, we identified cyber threats as one of the three principal threats, and we set aside £1.9 billion to protect us better against cyber, and a large chunk of that went to the NHS.
We're spending you didn't pay for the upgrade in 2015.
Hang on, we're spending around £50 million on the NHS cyber systems to improve their security. We have encouraged the NHS trusts to reduce their exposure to the weakest system, the Windows XP. Only 5%, less than 5% of the trusts actually use that system anymore, and there is money available to strengthen these systems.
But you did not pay for them to strengthen that system at the crucial moment in 2015, did you?
That was an old system. We didn't want them to use that. We wanted them to use modern systems that are better protecting. No, we warned them, and they were warned again in the spring.
So it's
they were
the fault
warned
of the
again
trusts,
of the threats.
not of the government. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we all have to work at this. The NHS wasn't particularly targeted. The same attacks applied to Nissan on Friday and in other areas of the economy and indeed around the world. But let me just assure you, we are spending money on strengthening the cyber defence of our hospital system.
Is it the case still that the nuclear submarines, the Trident submarines, are using Windows XP?
No, we never comment on the different systems, obviously for reasons of security, that our submarines use.
Well, they better not be.
But our Vanguard submarines, I can absolutely assure you, are safe and operate in isolation when they're out on patrol. And I have complete confidence in our nuclear deterrent.
So there is no possibility of a malware attack against the military, as we've seen against the NHS?
I can assure you the nuclear deterrent is fully protected.
Let's talk about you talk about the nuclear deterrent. You used a strange phrase a little while ago when you said that you, in certain circumstances, you thought we would use first strike in nuclear weapons. Can you explain what those circumstances
Yes, the key to the nuclear deterrent is to leave uncertainty in the mind of any potential adversary if he's looking at a country to attack as to exactly what kind of response he can expect. It's to leave ambiguity in the mind of your enemies, and that's why we never rule out whether we would apply first strike or not.
So you can imagine actually using nuclear weapons before anybody else has?
Well, we use them every day, Andrew, every night.
Not like I'm talking about.
Well, what I'm talking about, we use them as a deterrent.
Things.
Yes, but the job of the nuclear weapon is to deter. It's done that successfully for over 50 years since we've had our submarine fleet.
See, you've been very, very critical of Labour on the nuclear issue and defence generally.
And rightly. Look at
nonetheless,
that policy.
They might say that the problem with your side is they want to talk first and bomb later. You always want to bomb first and talk later. No. Can I ask you, is there a single war since the Second World War that you haven't been in favour of?
Well, we obviously, when we voted on the Iraq War, we were under the impression given by the then Labour government...
But you voted for it.
I voted for it, like a lot of MPs, because we were told there were weapons of mass destruction there. And it turned out, actually, there weren't.
Were you wrong, and do you regret voting for that war?
Well, I regret the prospectus on which it was embarked. It was right...
But you regret voting for it?
Well, hang on. Yeah, I regret voting for it on the basis there were weapons of mass destruction, because they clearly weren't. But we were dealing with a dictator who had invaded other countries, and we were part of an international coalition. And the problem with Labour's approach is they're now saying they would never commit. And you even heard Emily Thornberry now suggesting they might negotiate over the Falklands. I think that's shocking.
Well, let's turn to another war that you supported. You're very much in favour of use of force in Libya. And let's read you again the Foreign Select Committee report on what's happened in Libya after the war that you were so keen on. It resulted in political and economic collapse, inter-militia and inter-tribal warfare, humanitarian and migrant crises, widespread human rights violations and the spread of Gaddafi regime weapons across the region and the growth of ISIL in North Africa. In short, it was a total disaster, and you voted for it.
Well, the reason for it, if you remember, was to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi, where an entire city was potentially going to be wiped out. That's why we had the intervention. Now, you're right. When you do intervene, we need to learn the lessons of each of these conflicts, that there needs to be a proper plan for stabilisation afterwards. I've been working with other defence ministers in the coalition for precisely that in Iraq, after Mosul is eventually liberated, that we stabilise these areas and bring in security after the war is over, to ensure that the Sunnis there, for example, have a proper stake in the running of their country.
One domestic question, if I may. You've launched a new housing policy, council housing policy this morning. There are two small gaps in that policy so far as we can see so far. How many houses and how much money?
Well, the money is coming from the 1.4 billion we earmarked for capital expenditure from the autumn statement last year. So the money is
not new money. You're taking it from something else.
Well, it's not new money, but the amount of money for each council will depend on the deals we strike with places like Manchester and Birmingham to get more social housing built in these areas of a high enough quality that tenants eventually will be able to buy. It's a very attractive policy that will give people a real alternative to waiting to get into a council house or a flat of their choice.
Well, you and Emily Thornberry are coming back in a little while for a love-in, but for now, thank you very much indeed.
I'm not sure about the love-in.
Now, coming up later this morning, Andrew Neil will be talking to the Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, about Labour's plan for a Robin Hood tax, and he'll be joined by the Home Office Minister, Brandon Lewis. That's the Sunday Politics at 11 here on BBC One. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister and leader of the Scottish Nationalists, made it absolutely clear at the beginning of the campaign what she thought it was all about. Independence, she said, was at the heart of the election, and she's with me now here in the studio. Nicola Sturgeon, in an independent Scotland, will children be better able to read and write than they are now?
Well, regardless of whether or not in the future Scotland becomes independent, in Scotland right now we're focusing very much on improving standards in education. If we look at our education system, we've expanded early years education. We have a new school curriculum in place which has been praised by the OECD. We have record numbers of young people leaving school with higher passes, advanced higher passes, and going on into further education or training or employment. We have identified a particular issue with literacy and numeracy, and we also are determined to accelerate the progress in closing the attainment gap. So we have a massive programme of reform underway right now to do that.
On literacy, your record is absolutely terrible. Your own government figures show that you have, among 13 and 14-year-olds, only less than half are now performing well in reading and writing, and that's gone down from 70% in just a few years, under the SNP.
Well, firstly, let me say I've been very open that that's not good enough, but just to put that into context, we have a survey that measures pupils in the second year of secondary school, but measures them against the standards that they are expected to achieve in the third year of secondary school. And we have other information that show that by the time young people are in the third year, more than 80% are reaching the required level. But we have, as I said, we've got a new curriculum in place, Curriculum for Excellence. It's been praised by the OECD, but they've made certain recommendations to us about how we improve the teaching of literacy and numeracy. So right now we've got a new national improvement framework. We have an attainment challenge. We have an attainment fund putting significant extra resources into education.
Frameworks and challenges and fund. Do you know what is going wrong in Scottish schools?
We have had some advice that the new curriculum is not focusing... The new curriculum for excellence, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is about educating young people to be good citizens, to not just absorb facts and figures.
They need to be able to read and write as well.
I'm coming on to accept that point, to encourage young people not just to absorb facts and figures, but to be able to analyse that and make sense of the world they live in. It's the right thing to do. But we have had some advice that we need to have more of a focus within that curriculum on literacy and numeracy. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. So we've introduced new benchmarks for the teaching of literacy and numeracy. And, you know, I'm interested in watching...
Benchmarks and all the rest of it. Well, but under the SNP, things have got worse, and quite dramatically so.
I would challenge that in terms of the general performance of education. I mean, I look at the situation right now...
Numeracy and literacy, there's no question
I'm not denying that in terms of literacy and numeracy, and I'm telling you what we are doing to address that. And you say, well, frameworks and benchmarks. I look at the debate in England just now about falling budgets in schools. We've just taken a decision to increase the budgets that schools have by £120 million, money going direct to head teachers, which is giving them the ability to invest in measures that they think will improve literacy and numeracy.
You're 700 teachers short at the moment in Scotland, so you need to spend some money.
Teaching recruitment is a challenge, not just in Scotland, but in many countries. That's why right now we are increasing teacher intake. The General Teaching Council in Scotland is looking at different ways to bring different kinds of people into teaching. We're trying to encourage retired teachers to come back into teaching. So I'm being very frank about it.
You could pay them some more, that might help.
Well, we have negotiations with teaching unions, as is the case in England, about the pay and conditions of teachers. That's certainly one of the issues that we've always got to keep in mind. But we also need to be both frank about the challenges we've got in education. Some of the challenges are not unique to Scotland, but we also have to recognise that the fundamentals of Scottish education in many respects are very strong. And I repeat again, we now have record numbers of young people coming out of our schools with higher and advanced higher passes and going into what we call positive destinations. So I'm focused on improving these areas that we need to improve, but also making sure that we don't do a disservice to teachers and pupils across the country by saying everything about Scottish education is bad, because emphatically it is not.
All right, well, let's return to what you said in the Independence Blueprint in 2013 about the PISA or OECD rankings. You said Scottish pupils outperform the OECD average in reading and science. The latest results show that we have halted a period of relative international decline since 2000. Can you tell us what's happened since then?
No, we have seen that situation not as good as we want it to be. Look, Andrew, I'm not going to sit here and deny that. We have the PISA study. We also have what's called SSLN, which was a study, the latest version of which was published last week. I should say it's a sample survey, and it looks at actually quite small numbers of pupils. One of the things we have done is introduce, and it's the National Improvement Framework.
You didn't challenge the PISA rankings when they were going well for you. You can hardly challenge them now they're going so badly.
I didn't challenge them.
Right.
I said I accepted them.
Accept them.
I absolutely, I know, and I've said this many times before, I know how important a good education has been to me in my life. I want every young person in Scotland to have the best education. The vast majority of young people in Scotland do get the best of education, but there are areas where we need to do better, and I am not shying away from that.
And yet, under the SNP, something serious has gone wrong. Scotland used to be one of the most best educated countries in the world.
On many measures, it still is.
And you have all the powers. You have all the powers to change this, and yet things are going backwards.
Well, on literacy and numeracy, we have a particular challenge, but on many other measures of Scottish education, that is just not true. We are not going backwards.
Literacy and numeracy are kind of important.
Look, I think you're trying to conduct this interview on the basis that I'm being defensive here. I'm not being defensive. I absolutely readily accept the areas where we need to do better. That's why we have put such effort into the initiatives and the reforms that we are taking forward. And the point I was going to make earlier on, which I didn't get the chance to finish, is that we are actually introducing more transparency so that I can be held more to account. So instead of sample surveys like the ones we've got, we will have information on every pupil in Scotland at the required levels, broken down, not just by local authority, but school by school, so that there'll be no hiding place for any politician on the performance of Scottish education.
And you said not so long ago that you wanted to be judged by this and your neck would be on the line.
Absolutely.
And you're looking a little Mary Queen of Scots at the moment on that subject.
I don't wish to be Mary Queen of Scots. Look, I've been First Minister for 2.5 years, and I said when I became First Minister that this was what I wanted to be the defining priority of however many years I am First Minister, and I hold to that. So by the time that we're at the next Scottish election, I want to see improvement. And, you know, we're talking about literacy and numeracy. The other big challenge we've got in Scotland, which again is not unique to Scotland, is to close the attainment gap between the richest and the poorest young people.
And you're still behind England on that.
Well, on some measures, and we don't measure it in exactly the same way. You and I have had the discussion about university entrance before, where the measurements are different in Scotland and England. But in a sense, I'm not sitting here wanting to make those comparisons. I want Scotland to be the best on its own terms.
Let's move on to another aspect of domestic policy. Is it a scandal if nurses have to use food banks because of their low pay? And that is happening in Scotland. According to the Scottish Royal College of Nursing spokespeople, that is happening in Scotland. And again, you have the power as the Scottish Parliament to set public sector pay. You could raise taxes and you could pay Scottish nurses properly. Why don't you?
Well, we have work to tackle low pay. Let me set out what happens here with nurses' pay, and it's the same in the rest of the UK as it is in Scotland. We have the independent pay review body, and it makes recommendations. The Scottish Government, unlike the Westminster Government, has always accepted those recommendations. We have had a period of pay restraint in the public sector because of our determination to protect jobs.
They've lost 14% in terms of real value over the past period of time, and you could correct this.
We will continue to work through the pay review body to make sure that nurses get the pay they deserve. I do accept that.
But you opposed higher pay for nurses this week.
Well, look, no, we didn't.
The Royal College of Nursing is now talking about strike action.
Let me just set this out, because we work through the peer review body. We have agreed with the unions that we're going to jointly commission some research. But there's another important point here. Because of the action we've taken in Scotland on low pay, and because of the commitment we gave that nurses would always get their entitlement to progression, a newly qualified nurse in Scotland is paid £300 more than a newly qualified nurse in England. Somebody at the bottom level of Agenda for Change, it's much more than that. We've also protected the nurse bursary, and we're not asking nurse students to pay tuition fees. So it's tough for nurses out there, but we have done far more than any other government in the UK to try to protect the pay of nurses.
OK, you have said that independence is at the heart of this choice, and you've talked a lot about material changes. And that you watch the way public opinion is going in Scotland. If the Conservatives move ahead and you fall back in this election, is that not a material change?
Let's wait and see who wins the election in Scotland.
An if at the start of that.
Can I just set out my position here, because it is important. For me, this is a question of, at the end of the Brexit process, does Scotland get a choice about our future? You know, the position of the Tories and Labour UK-wide is that no matter how badly the Brexit negotiations go, people should just have to like it or lump it. I don't think that's right. So at the end of the Brexit process, I believe people in Scotland should have a choice about our own future. But there's a more immediate priority in this election.
After we've left or before we've left? Sorry.
At the end of the process, so that when the terms of Brexit are clear and people can compare that with the terms and the implications of independence. But the point I was going to make is, in this election, there's actually a more immediate priority and opportunity for Scotland, and that is about making sure our voice is heard in the Brexit negotiations. This is an important point, because there is a lot of concern, even among some people who voted leave, that we are headed down the road of a very extreme Brexit. Now, the Scottish Government previously published proposals that would have accepted we were leaving the EU, but would have protected our place in the single market. The Prime Minister dismissed those proposals out of hand. This election
she thought
actually,
it was impractical and impossible
she didn't look at them seriously. So this election actually gives the Scottish people the chance to give real democratic legitimacy to those proposals. So my message in this election on Brexit is, whether you voted leave or remain, whether you were yes or no in 2014, if you vote SNP, you're strengthening my hand to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard in these negotiations, and that we don't sacrifice jobs in our economy. We can press the case for Scotland's place in the single market.
A lot of SNP voters voted to leave the EU. You have always said in the past that Scotland must be a full member of the EU after independence. And it's being suggested by some people that you may move to say, actually, EFTA would be all right. Is that the case?
Well, we published compromise.
Would EFTA be all right?
Well, if Scotland is independent, our position always has been, as long as I've been in the SNP, and continues to be, that we want Scotland to be a full member of the European Union. What we did towards the end of...
Including the euro?
We don't want to go into the euro, and no member of the EU can be forced into the euro, and Sweden is one of the examples of that. But what we did at the end of last year was recognise that, some people voted Remain, a majority in Scotland voted Remain, some voted Leave, Scotland voted differently to England. So we tried to see if there was compromise ground, and we put forward proposals that would have accepted we were leaving the EU as part of the UK, but try to protect our single market membership.
Now, can I just ask you very briefly, a sort of yes or no, I'm afraid, would Scottish membership, an independent Scottish membership of EFTA, be an acceptable compromise in these circumstances, yes or no?
My position is I want Scotland to be in the EU. Now, we have to set out, if we're in an independence referendum, and we're not in that right now, the process for gaining or retaining, depending on where we are in the Brexit process, EU membership. Now, it may be that we have a phased approach to that by necessity, and
EFTA first, EU later, kind of thing.
It may be by necessity, even if we didn't want that. That was now we have to set that out at the time, because there are still some uncertainties, many uncertainties around the Brexit process. But in this election, if we want to have a chance of protecting our place in the single market, on which 80,000 Scottish jobs depend, then vote SNP to strengthen our hand to try to do that.
You got the line out at the end there. Nicola Sturgeon, thanks for joining us in the studio in London. Now, look at what's coming up straight after this programme.
Join us at 10 from Salford, where we'll be debating life's two inevitabilities, taxes and death. Is it right to take more than 50% in tax? And then, as the snowflake generation gathers ever more force, we ask, do we have a right not to be offended? And last of all, is it easier to face death if you believe in God? See you at 10 on BBC One.
Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, are back with me. Welcome to you both. Emily Thornberry, there's been a lot of attacks on your party's patriotism and so forth over the last few weeks, as you've seen. And another story in the papers today about Jeremy Corbyn and the IRA. What's your message to those people who are patriotic, working-class voters, and they look at this stuff and they say, I just don't like it?
Well, I think that there were negotiations going on behind the scenes, and there were people speaking openly, and this is something which has been known for 30 years, and it's being dragged up at this particular time because there's a general election on. And I think
not surprising.
And I think, well, yeah, but you know,
Prime Minister.
I know. I mean, I think the question.
Risk.
No, I understand that, and I suppose if you judge people by who it is that you spend time with, the question has to be: do you remember where you were on the 27th of May, 2007?
I'm sure you're going to tell me.
Yes, I am. So you were in Syria and you were celebrating at a reception the re-election of President Assad with a 99% percentage of the vote. Now, I'm not going to judge you on you going to a reception with Assad, and I don't think that people should judge Jeremy by trying to talk to people who might be open to a settlement in Northern Ireland.
I think there's a little bit of a difference.
Is this true?
There was a parliamentary visit. I was on a parliamentary all-party visit to Syria back in 2007. MPs have gone every year to Syria during the better times in the relationship between Syria and Britain.
But you were at the party, weren't you?
I don't recall any party in Syria. I remember a fact-finding visit to Syria that happened every year with MPs going out there. But the difference, of course...
Did you meet Assad when you were there?
I did meet Assad, indeed.
Shake his hand? And...
Indeed, I met Assad.
And you celebrated his re-election.
10 years... I didn't celebrate his re-election.
That was what the reception was for. It was for celebrating his re-election.
Nonsense. 10 years ago, we had a different relationship with Assad here, but there's a huge moral difference between talking to other foreign leaders, and I meet them all the time as Defence Secretary, and Jeremy Corbyn's quite open support for the IRA, which was actually engaged in Northern Ireland.
Having open support for the IRA. You really can't just go around making this stuff up. There's an election on, and people need to make decisions on the basis of the truth. You've just said, for example, that I want to negotiate the future of the Falklands. That is bollocks. I did not.
What? Just say again, come on.
It is untrue.
You implied, just 20 minutes ago, you implied sitting there that there should be some
Michael,
international
you really just can't make this up as you go along. People need to make decisions in this general election based on facts and based on information, proper information. And it's not right for you to go slinging around dead cats the way that you do. People need to concentrate and work out, because there's a serious choice to be made.
And you've told us, your excuse is Jeremy Corbyn is on some kind of journey. But that is too great a risk for this country. Somebody who's against a nuclear deterrent,
in relation to NATO,
soft on terrorism.
In relation to NATO, there has been a change.
He wants a demilitarised
and we are
zone.
clear.
Can I ask you both about a word that is being used again and again, landslide? Tom Watson said that if things don't change, then the Conservatives are on course for a Thatcher-style landslide. Why do you think he said that?
Well, I suppose he may have been distracted by the polls, but the polls are not things that have been terribly reliable but until now. And we have another 3 weeks, and we are going to be out there. We're going to be putting out the message and the truth about what Labour is standing for and what a Labour government will be, and what the choice is.
Michael Fallon, are you heading for a landslide, do you think?
Not a vote has been cast yet. It's far, far too early for people to start predicting the result of this election. We are going for a stronger majority to get a successful exit from the European Union and to build a stronger, fairer Britain after that.
You've nearly said strong and stable. Thank you very much.
He's getting there.
Thank you both very much. That's all we've got time for this Sunday. We'll be back at the same time next week when our guests will include UKIP's leader Paul Nuttall. But until then, goodbye.